Hello and welcome to today's National 8A webinar. I'm Melissa Saz, the Executive Director of the National 8A Association. We are a nonprofit with a mission to provide education and guidance for all aspiring, current, and graduate 8As. We are also proud to work with minority small businesses, hub-zoned, veteran-owned, women-owned, JVs, agencies, large primes, and industry professionals. Before we begin, I'd like to note that this webinar is being recorded and all presentation materials will be posted on our website. If you would like to ask a question, please use the chat box and select everyone or email us at events@national8aassociation.org. I'd like to now welcome and turn the mic over to today's speaker, Kevin Plexico, the Senior Vice President of Information Solutions at Deltek, who will be presenting on the Federal Outlook, Small Business Contracting Trends to Impact Small Businesses in 2022. Hi, Kevin.
Melissa, thank you. Thank you for the introduction. And for those of you who've joined, appreciate your taking the time to join us today. Just for quick background, I'm Kevin Plexico. I'm responsible for the GovWin product here at Deltek. For those of you who are familiar with Deltek, you'll probably know our GovWin product is a market intelligence solution that is intended to equip customers with information to help them grow their government contracting business. And we provide that in the form of contract information for federal as well as state, local, and education contractors in the US. And most recently, we expanded into Canada as well. What I'm planning on doing today is taking you through some of the trends that we see affecting the market in general, as well as specifically small businesses in the federal contracting space. I think there's a lot going on for sure. It has been for the last several years. That's worth talking about, and hopefully impart some good insight into for you to help shape your strategies and your plans as you think about engaging with the government market. So I'm going to put this in the context of kind of four major themes. The first, and where we'll spend the majority of our time, is around the funding outlook and what we've seen in terms of major swings in the nature of government contract spending. We obviously have a piece of legislation in the form of the Infrastructure Investment Jobs Act that passed, I guess it was early this year. We also have, or maybe it was late last year at this point, we also have a proposal of the Build Back Better plan, which is essentially still in limbo at this point. We did have appropriations for 2022 pass in March after a number of continuing resolutions that we've come to experience on an annual basis in the federal space. Of course, we have the war in Ukraine and the federal role in supporting Ukraine in their defense of their country against Russia. And then we have most recently the budget request for the coming fiscal year. And we're going to talk just a little bit about each of those. On the compliance requirements, I think while there's a growing opportunity in the government contracting space, there's also in many respects, a growing cost of doing business. We're seeing this in the form of additional compliance requirements around cybersecurity, supply chain, climate, as well as diversity, equity, and inclusion that the administration is looking to push to raise the bar for federal agencies and contractors that support them. But we are also seeing a growing focus on small business and small business policies that should provide additional opportunities for companies that are in the small business community. And then the last theme I wanted to talk about was what we've seen in terms of contract consolidation, because at the same time we see agencies looking to push more money to small businesses, we're also seeing agencies adopt IDIQ-based contracts. And because of the category management initiative, essentially reducing the number of prime contract positions that are available in the market, which in many respects sometimes seem at odds with what they're trying to accomplish in terms of increasing dollars for small business. So these are some of the major, just kind of bucket this, major four themes that we're watching that I think are going to have a big and profound impact on the small business community in the year and probably years to come. So let's start with the funding environment. I'll do a little recap of what we've seen in terms of contract spending for the last several years. And you can see for 2021, while we had a bit of a dip, what I always tell companies to think about is, think about what happened in 2020 with the major investments from the coronavirus and the government response to coronavirus. We had some pretty significant spikes in civilian and defense contracting. And if you were to compare 2021 to 2019, which is probably, you know, kind of drawing a line between those two, you still see pretty good growth and huge investments in contract spending as we see growth in appropriations and funding for some of the initiatives that have come out of both the Trump administration and the Biden administration, as well as the bipartisan budget agreements that have come out. We've basically seen pretty steady increases in contract spending correlated to those increases in the base budget. And this past year with 2020, while we saw a slight decrease in civilian and a bit more profound decrease in defense, again, I would just ask you to think of it as being a comparison versus 2019 versus 2020, given the outsized investment we saw in 2020 related to the government's response to COVID-19. So pretty strong year. We're expecting 2022 to be another strong year as we've seen appropriations get enacted, and we'll talk more about that in just a moment. If you're a small business, we also have good news in terms of the growth in small business contracting. This gives you a picture of the dollar amounts that are obligated to contracts with small business. So for 2021, nearly $150 billion, which would be a record in contract obligations to small business, and that represents 23% of total spending. You're going to see a little bit of difference between this calculation and what you might see out of the SBA and their calculation. They do some puts and takes depending on the nature of the spending, and we're looking at it more in terms of raw dollars. So if you're looking to compare this to SBA, the calculations are going to be a little off, or a little different, I should say. We're just looking at pure raw dollars, total obligations, and then what percent went to small business. It's still a record percentage at 23%, so growing in terms of percentage, as well as obviously with the total contract spending going up, a growth in the dollar amounts that are obligated to small businesses as well. And one of the things that is often important to look at as a small business is how much of it's coming from some of the different socioeconomic programs that the federal government operates versus a small business winning work on their own or of their own accord without the benefit of some of those programs. I thought this was a really good way of looking at this. This gives you a sense of the small business contract dollars spent. What percentage of them are going through the different programs, or the dollars that are not directly set aside or not reported as being set aside through one of the core programs that the federal agencies operate. So as you can see here, the majority of awards to small business didn't have a set aside or were not reported in terms of what set aside program they were offered. So they're winning it, on a full and open basis, or at least an unrestricted basis. That represents about 2/3 of the dollars that were awarded without a set aside. So that's pretty strong progress in terms of the dollars spent being awarded without the benefit of a specific program. If you peel that back a little bit in terms of those that went through one of the programs, typically each of those programs has both a set aside component, meaning where they've competed it as a set aside, or a sole source award that usually has some kind of dollar cap limit on it. When we looked at the amount that went through those programs, about just under 20% of it were typically awarded through a sole source versus the set aside competition. So you still see agencies, for the most part, favoring competition in the programs versus sole source awards, and that shows up in the percentage of dollars that are getting awarded through those different programs. So pretty healthy spending trajectory that we've been on. Obviously, with the passage of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, this provides additional money for opportunities, though a lot of this money is going to be flowing down through state and local governments. If you think about, I would say, while the total funding was close to $1.2 trillion, about half of that was what you might consider to be steady state. It was continuing program funding that was already occurring for the transportation programs and infrastructure investments that are in place in the federal market. So it added roughly an additional $550 billion to infrastructure appropriations. As I mentioned, about 2/3 of the funding is expected to flow down to state and local governments and tribal governments. This is because of the nature of a lot of the funding for infrastructure is for transportation infrastructure, and most of that is administered through the Department of Transportation and the Highway Transportation Fund programs that the DOT operates. And also, the vast majority of the funding is expected to be dispersed over the course of the next 5 years. So unlike we'll take the the coronavirus response dollars from the federal government, which was flowing extremely quickly because of the nature of the urgency of those initiatives, agencies have a much longer lead time, and I think state and local governments will have a much longer lead time to award these infrastructure funds. So we don't expect kind of the same urgency in terms of rolling out the awards that we would see for something that's more of a response to a pandemic, for example, or some national emergency. There's also a number of new organizations that are getting created out of this. For example, the Advanced Research Projects Agency Infrastructure, ARPA-I, and the Department of Transportation, in keeping with what we've seen across government, where they've set up these research agencies fashioned after the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency to advance particular initiatives. So we've seen it with health, we're seeing it here with transportation and infrastructure, and that's something just important to watch as the government looks to advance some of the research and development initiatives associated with some of these major investments. To give you a sense for how these infrastructure investments are allocated, you'll notice that the vast majority of it is in the roads, bridges, and major projects. That's the reason that so much of it's getting allocated through the Department of Transportation and the highway trust funds that we've talked about earlier. Some of the other noteworthy ones: power infrastructure, passenger and freight rails, another big one, and then of course one that's not typically thought of as infrastructure is in broadband, and ensuring that, especially in this environment that we're in now with the social distancing, that all communities have access to high-speed internet capabilities and shoring up those connections across the country. And the last way of looking at this that I wanted to share is just the timing of the dollars and our estimation of how those dollars would be allocated, whether it be at a state and local government level, a federal level, some combination of the two, or down even as far as industry and academia. You can see the vast majority is expected to go through state and local governments, about half of it. And again, that's tied to the nature of the spending being largely on highway transportation, roads, bridges, et cetera. I'll just touch on the Build Back Better initiative. This is the framework that was proposed, and it's had multiple iterations. This has been essentially in limbo for the last several months, and it's unclear whether this is going to come out again or maybe come out in smaller chunks and smaller pieces. At present, it looks like it's just kind of in this limbo and not advancing. But this was the president's social program as well as climate program that we expected to get traction in Congress. It got quite a bit of attention, but at this point, it's largely kind of deadlocked in a state of limbo, and we don't really yet know if this is going to resurface or show up in some other form or fashion. I did want to talk briefly about the impact of the invasion in Ukraine and the war between Ukraine and Russia. We've already seen the president draw on what they call the Presidential Drawdown Authority. This is basically the president's discretion to draw on the existing defense funds and munitions and arms, et cetera, to equip the government of Ukraine with weapons to defend itself. We've seen additional funding show up in the 2022 appropriations in the form of $13.6 billion that was included in that. A lot of that's for humanitarian relief as well as weapons. And then we just recently also heard the administration calling for an additional $30 billion as part of the 2023 budget process in the form of a supplemental that he's asking Congress to fund in support of this initiative. I think, while we can look at the money that's going to the weapons and the humanitarian relief associated to Ukraine and Ukraine defense, I think the broader story here is going to be the nature of the diminishing relations with Russia and what that means for our government's appetite for investing in the Defense Department. When the Biden administration came in, the expectation was that defense spending was going to be held relatively stable. We had pretty significant growth in the defense budget under the Trump administration. The Biden administration was looking to hold it relatively steady and continue to fund it at the levels that kind of it departed the Trump administration with. I think that appetite has flipped to a more aggressive posture in terms of defense spending, not specifically just related to Ukraine, though that's part of it, but more in response to the national security threats that are posed by Russia's more aggressive posture, and I think to a lesser extent China's posture as well. So I think while we had expected defense spending to be flattening, I think that that trend is expected to reverse a bit, and we're probably going to be back into the growth. And you'll see that show up in the president's budget request for 2023 that appropriators are going to be taking up this summer. Just to put a bow on 2022 appropriations, you can see here the appropriations levels for the major departments and agencies in the blue bar. The blue line shows you the percent increase or change versus the 2021 appropriations levels. I think in aggregate, defense spending is set at $782 billion. That's a 5.7% increase versus 2021. So a pretty healthy increase, particularly when you consider the size of the defense budget. And on the non-defense side, or what you might call civilian agencies, set at $730 billion in discretionary appropriations, which is up 6.7%. So you're basically looking at a 6% increase in spending, with the vast majority of agencies seeing increases over 2021. And as we look ahead to 2023, the president's budget was released a bit delayed. At the time the budget came out, appropriations for 2022 were still being kind of finalized, and the ink was still wet, if you will. So they essentially were rolling out the budget as a comparison versus 2021. So just keep that in mind when you're looking at this percent change of 14.9%. That's comparing it to the 2021 budget for the 2023 budget request. Still a very healthy percent. So if it was 6% in 2022, you're talking about a 7 or 8% increase for 2023. That represents $1.6 trillion in spending, about 770 billion of it on the defense side, $855 billion on the civilian side, and you can see the relative growth rates between those two. This did not factor in the $30 billion request that the administration had rolled out since then for defense of Ukraine. So that would be additive to these numbers, and we'll have to see how that manifests itself in the appropriations process and funding in Congress. So all in all, from a market opportunity point of view, certainly funding outlook is expecting to be growing. We expect it to grow in 2022 when the dust settles on this year that we're in, and we expect it to grow again in 2023, given the social policies of the administration and Congress, as well as the appetite for investment in the Defense Department, given the nature of our international threats in this present environment. So, as I mentioned, growing opportunity available, but it does come with some strings attached if you're a federal contractor. We're seeing, in addition to the existing compliance requirements around things like cost accounting, financial management, your HR practices, with the new administration coming in, we've seen rollout of a number of executive orders and memoranda that are designed to raise the bar in a few key areas. Specifically, we'll talk about just briefly cybersecurity. We already had the CMMC well underway under the prior administration, I think even dating back to the Obama administration. We are in the process of working through what they call CMMC 2.0 as a way of shoring up the cybersecurity practices of contractors that are supporting federal agencies. The big switch there is allowing companies, specifically smaller companies, the ability to self-certify versus having to rely on a third-party authorizer. We also saw an additional executive order that would call for companies to have more accountability in reporting incidents and issues that they run into, and data collection that they have to federal agencies when they have a breach or have incidents, that we expect to increase the cost for businesses doing business in the federal space. We've also seen a focus on supply chain, and this is coming at it from a couple different angles. First of all, the integrity of the supply chain, meaning the ability for federal agencies to get key capabilities, whether it be microchips, technology, equipment that we've all seen kind of come under the under the challenges of the supply chain issues that we've seen since the coronavirus has kind of took over the world. We're also seeing a strong preference for Buy America and relying on domestic suppliers, and there's been lots of guidance that's been coming out around how companies should be thinking about that and how agencies should be thinking about that, in particular relative to core discretionary funding, but also as it relates to the infrastructure legislation that we talked about earlier. There's been a much greater focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion, and this is going to tie into not only companies' HR policies and how they hire people, but also federal agencies' use of minority-owned businesses, and that's one of the areas that we're going to talk about here a little bit more deeply, since it does have a big impact on the 8A program specifically, as well as small businesses in general. And then we've also seen a focus on climate and challenging agencies and the companies that support them to achieve certain goals in terms of sustainability, as well as carbon pollution, emissions, and also rethinking federal infrastructure and operations to be more sustainable and resilient relative to climate impacts. So all these are going to be carrying, to some extent or another, additional what I would describe as costs of doing business with federal agencies. The good news is, and one of the reasons you see companies that do business in the federal market so diversified, is because once you've satisfied all these compliance requirements, you can do a lot of different things for federal agencies in support of them, because you've gone through the gauntlet of compliance requirements that typically put up barriers for other companies that might be more, we'll say, casually interested in government contracting. So I wanted to spend a little bit more time on the small business prioritization. We saw this show up in a few different executive orders, but one of them, executive order on promoting competition in the American economy. The call here was to increase small disadvantaged business set aside contracting to 15% by FY 2025. The challenge for this coming fiscal year was 10%, to get it to 10%. We'll have to see how successful agencies are at achieving that. One of the things that they're paying attention to, and this is going to come up as an issue in just a moment, is the recognition that while they're spending more dollars with small business, that doesn't mean they're involving more small businesses in contracting. The fact that they're doing more business in terms of dollar amounts doesn't necessarily mean that they're necessarily increasing the participation, and that's something the administration has been noticing and starting to pay attention to, which I think is important. And the reason that's important, it shows up really in this chart. If you look at the blue bar, that shows the dollars of contracting that are being awarded. And you can see again, and going into 2020, the dollar amounts have been going up. We saw in 2021, it went down just a little bit. You don't see that reflected in this chart, but we talked about that earlier. But you look at that orange line, and that's the number of unique prime contractors that are engaging in the market. So while agencies are spending more money than ever, because of initiatives like the IDIQ contract adoptions, category management, as well as some of the barriers that are being introduced in the form of additional compliance requirements, we're actually seeing the number of small businesses and the number of total businesses in the market decline. And this is something that we expect the administration to be paying more attention to. The SBA, I know, is paying more attention to it, and they're looking to diversify and expand the number of companies that are supporting federal customers, at the same time leveraging the strengths of better buying practices that we see in category management and the use of IDIQ contracts. So I'll wrap up, and then we can jump into some Q&A. These four trends, I think, are really the big trends that I think companies need to be paying attention to. As I mentioned, the bright outlook remains bright. I think if you're a government contractor, the amount of money the federal agencies are going to be spending in the coming years is optimistically going to be growing. I think we're a few years away from some kind of budget or economic crisis that forces some reduction in spending or rethinking of entitlement programs or tax policy at some point. We all know that those of us who follow the budget documents that the Congressional Budget Office puts out, we are spending more money than we're generating in tax revenue, and at some point, what we spend and what we make in tax revenue has to be reconciled. But at the moment, we're seeing an appetite for taking on additional debt to address the social and defense needs of the country. At the same time, we're seeing expanding compliance requirements that are raising the bar for new entrants and increasing the cost for companies that are doing business in the market. What I always tell companies is if you're serious about the federal market, think about these compliance requirements not as some kind of drudging task that you have to take on, but more as an opportunity to differentiate yourself. One of the things that you notice in a lot of the GWAC competitions that are being conducted by agencies like GSA is their scoring mechanisms that they're using for evaluating bidders gives a lot of credit for compliance capabilities. So are you ISO certified? Do you have a compliant cost accounting system? Do you have a materials management system? Have you addressed some of your cybersecurity issues? The extent you can address these compliance requirements differentiates you from other companies that maybe haven't made those investments. I think also in light of the bright outlook in terms of funding, we also see an administration that is focused on expanding the use of small businesses, in particular small disadvantaged businesses, which is for the most part largely what the 8A program is intended to support. And to the extent that that gets from where it is today to 15% over the course of the next 5 years would mean a profound amount of funding and contract awards going to small disadvantaged businesses. At the same time, we're seeing that contract consolidation that I think that the administration is starting to battle against because of the nature of IDIQ contracts and category management. So we're seeing fewer prime contract awards, more money to those companies that are engaging in the market, and that's something that we're going to have to continue to watch to see if that pattern reverses itself as funding increases. So with that, if you have any questions, I would encourage you to go ahead and post it in the chat window. Happy to take questions that you may have, and appreciate you taking the time today.
Thank you so much, Kevin. This was very insightful. I know we also dropped in the Deltek guide to the government contracting lifecycle. With that link, we'll also have it posted on our website for you all. But yes, I think this was very insightful, the impact for the small business community, and it was great to hear that there's not only an increase in appropriations for the DoD, but also civilian agencies, and that set aside goal for the SDBs as well is increasing. So I'm sure everyone on this call is very excited to spend those dollars. And again, if anybody has any questions for Kevin, if you don't get them into this chat, we can always send them over to him, or if you want to email him directly, I know his contact information was provided in this presentation deck. And also as a reminder, this webinar is being recorded and will be posted on our website after the fact, along with the presentation and the government contracting lifecycle guide. So yes, thank you so much, Kevin, for presenting with us today. We look forward to having you all hopefully join our next webinar next month. And we also have a couple events coming up if you want to check those out on our website. And if you have any questions for us or Kevin, please, again, feel free to reach out to us. Our contact information is here. So yeah, thank you everyone for joining.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Kevin. Yeah, appreciate the invitation. Thank you.
Yep, this concludes today's webinar. Goodbye, everyone.